Don Faber is a lifelong member of the PRCA. Assembling the pieces from what we know now from various sources who contacted us for the Bullet Point series, we believe that Don Faber may have been potentially actively abusing in the PRC for as many as 3 decades, from the 1960s through the 1980s. In researching this case, we identified Don Faber's birthday as 2/2/1936. This aligns with material found in the PRC bulletin of Don Faber turning 80 years old in February of 2016. This makes him currently the age of 86 years old, and places him at the age of 24 years old in the year 1960, shortly before the first known instance of his sexual abuse. Don Faber is another instance of a highly empowered member of the PRC who was sexually abusive to children. Don Faber held various institutional positions of power in the PRC throughout his entire lifetime in the denomination. He was business manager and photo and art staff for the Beacon Lights in 1955 as shown in Figure 1. He was chairman on PRC committees, subcommittees, such as the Reformed Witness Hour in 1981 as shown in Figure 2. Don Faber was also an elder at First PRC, the church where his membership was the majority of his life. Don Faber left First PRC somewhere between 2015 and 2018 to join Grace PRC, the church whose minister was at the time future Bullet Point entry Ron Van Overloop. He remains at Grace PRC to this day. For many years, Don Faber was sexually abusing young boys. At this moment, the victims that we are aware of were all young boys. It is suspected, but not conclusively proven, that all the targets of Don Faber's predatory sexual behavior were young males. We do not know how many instances happened before or after Don's eldership because we do not know the exact dates of the various abuses, and we do not know the exact dates of his term as elder at First PRC. What is also known is that at least one of Don's instances of abuse happened before Don Faber was an elder and quietly spoken about in the PRC rumor mill at the time. There was knowledge at the time and questions surrounding Don's activities before he was appointed as an elder. When Don Faber was selected as a candidate for an elder and eventually voted in, it was a shock and a scandal to many people who knew of Don Faber's sexually abusive behavior. An aspect to this story is that at the time of Don's elder nomination, there were many that denied Don's abuse. There were many that were ignorant of the abuse, both willfully and not. There were some that were told to disregard suspicions because it was just rumors of spiteful people. Many people treated this as normal and nothing to be concerned about. Many of these things will sound familiar to readers, especially those familiar with this forum around the time when the RVO saga was going on. The PRC has been like this for generations. The result of this is that people, children, are willfully endangered and vulnerable to being sexually abused. Don sexually assaulted young boys. Church people knew about it, and he still became an elder. Don Faber had a cabin by water which he often offered to families in the PRC to use. Don Faber kept many things at this cabin that would be enticing for young boys. Toys and activities such as a boat, water skiing, a plane, and more. Common elements across most stories of Don's abuse are Don's cabin, boat, and plane. We have confirmed instances of grooming at his cabin, as well as stories of suspected sexual abuse happening at Don's cabin, plane, and boat. Don was known to take young PR boys on extended excursions in his plane and boat. Once he had gained their trust and isolated these boys, Don would sexually abuse them. We also have instances of PR families with young boys going to Don Faber's cabin who were not sexually abused. In this way, Don Faber was normalizing trips to his cabin and use of his boat and plane for PR families, making himself seem trustworthy and harmless and presenting himself as a generous man in the PRC to offer such luxuries for other church members to enjoy. The exact nature of Don's sexual abuse is somewhat unclear. At least one of the sources who spoke to us unapologetically used the word rape. Other words used by different sources were sexual assault, sexual abuse, inappropriate behavior, and touching. The extent of what exactly constituted Don Faber's abuse is, at this point, unknown. In conservative churches like the PRC, sexual violence is heavily stigmatized. Survivors of sexual abuse, even though the abuse was not their fault, still do not want people to know what was done to them in order to prevent and escape having that stigma attached to themselves. This is especially true in cases of male-on-male sexual violence, where social awareness of homosexual rape and sexual assault of a victim who was not willingly participatory in the act could still be perceived as something that would cause irreparable reputational damage if it were known, all the more so within the PR church. For survivors of Don Faber's sexual abuse, it is likely that they have been living with the secret of their abuse, keeping it to themselves or a close network of trusted confidantes since their abuse, potentially as long as since the 1960s. Don Faber's callous abuse caused enormous psychological damage to many. We have some known instances of survivors and loved ones of survivors who have suffered mental breaks when grappling with Don's abuse. Don Faber has been an open secret in the PRC for over 50 years. There were kids at Covenant Christian High School in the late 1960s, early 1970s who contemporaneously knew about Don and his sexual abuse at the time. We have stories from this time period supporting that at least some of the kids themselves knew. Victims of Don's sexual violence did come forward and tell peers about their abuse. In at least one instance by a direct source, during high school a close peer confided in them as having been raped by Don. The source just froze up and didn't know what to do. They were just kids. They didn't know what to do with this information. How could you expect kids to know what to do? Covenant Christian High School was established in 1968, well within the time period that Don Faber was known to be actively abusing some known victims. Future bullet point Ronald Van Overloop also was active at CCHS in grooming girls by leaving gifts in their lockers and taking them out of class for counseling sessions. This means that Covenant Christian has had cases of sexual abuse of students during its entire existence from its very inception to recent history. When contextualized with bullet points #13 regarding abuse of elementary students in Illinois, this means that abuse towards children has happened at different schools, with different age children in different states, by different perpetrators, with one common factor, the PRC, and men who are highly empowered within it. The third-party investigation is desperately needed to investigate the schools, the commonality of abuse, the number of abused students in the PRC schools, the extent and type of abuse that has happened within those walls, and how to prevent this moving forward. Don Faber remains an open secret today in the PRC. In the various PRC, RPC rumor mills discussing the church's abuse problem, Don Faber is a known and discussed element among those in the know. There has been at least one survivor of Don's abuse that as of late has begun speaking up more publicly on this topic. The resurgence of the wider institutional abuse discussion in the PRC, RPC, and this website has renewed Don Faber's name in the rumor mill. Added onto this and complicating this is the fact that Don Faber is still alive and still sits in the pews of Grace PRC twice every Sunday. The PRC is still housing this abuser, despite there being a near ubiquitous presence in the rumor mills, at least one public accuser, and a general awareness of his many abuses that extends over 50 years. Don Faber is one of the most prolific abusers to ever exist in the PRC, potentially the most prolific. When asking sources about Don's prospective possible victim count, no one we talked to concretely knew the totality of Don's abuse count. Some suspected 10-20, some said potentially 40 or more. The true number of abused boys at the hands of Don Faber is unknown. When the third-party investigation happens, Don Faber will be a central question to identify just how many kids he sexually assaulted while in the PRC and why law enforcement never got involved. Something to consider is that given the known time range of Don's abuse, how many victims he had, and the gender of his victims, it is possible that some survivors of Don Faber's abuse are now in positions of power in the PRC, especially in the Michigan area. Don's victims would currently be of age for deacon, elder, and ministerial positions within the PRC. A reminder that we do not encourage speculation on names or doxing whatsoever. However, this element is another factor that is widely spoken about in the PRC, RPC rumor mills. It is relevant to the story and present in discussion, so we mention it here for that reason. The RPC rumor mill and ex-PR community uses it as ammunition to accuse people of power in the PRC as knowing about horrific abuse in the PRC for decades and not doing anything about it. The PRC rumor mills use it to speculate about the motivations of empowered men in the PRC who care and are fighting for justice for the abuse in the PRC is doing so because they are victims of Don. Stories of Don's abuse, who knew what and when, are near omnipresent within the hushed conversations of the PRC, RPC, and ex-PR communities when it comes to systemic abuse. When we started the Bullet Point series, there were people who reached out to us for help with this particular case, believing their loved ones may have been a victim of Don's but keep it secret. There were those who reached out to us asking us to widely publicize this abuse story to identify and reach out to potential survivors of Don's abuse and to help unburden their loved ones of something they believe to have kept buried inside for decades. We have no real way of knowing how many of these people exist who have bottled this up, kept it inside, and tortured themselves their whole lives. Since the stigma of male-on-male sexual violence is so high in the PRC, it is not unreasonable to assume the possibility that there could be many families like this in the PRC. Given the messages we received like this, there is ample reason to believe there are families like this reading this forum and following the Bullet Point series. If there are survivors of Don Faber's sexual abuse reading this bullet point entry, just know you are loved. If Don Faber abused you, it was not your fault and you need to hear that. Trust your loved ones, your wife, your kids, your friends, whoever it is you trust, and tell them. You do not have to carry this yourself. Survivors of Don Faber's abuse deserve justice, and we will fight for them here. At some point during the 1990s, at least one instance of Don Faber's sexual abuse surfaced. Don immediately confessed to his sins and he was disciplined by First PRC for his sexual sin. However, almost everyone we spoke to initially knew next to nothing regarding what sins Don confessed or the nature of this discipline. A credible source that reached out to us did confirm that Don Faber was removed from office and barred from holding the office of elder again, but that there was not any further discipline beyond that. Given other stories that have been sent to us regarding other abusers, there have been qualified instances of PRC consistories minimizing sexual assault and rape by categorizing it as sins of fornication, completely neutering the assault, removing the element of consent and abuse entirely, and vaguely masking everything behind the general idea of sexual sin. We do not know what sins Don confessed to, but given what we have been told regarding Don's abuse, doubt is reasonably warranted regarding what Don confessed to and what First PRC accepted as repentance. No public statement was ever made that we know of either to the PRC or the Grand Rapids community regarding the danger he posed to children, and there appears to be no safeguarding done whatsoever on behalf of the PRC regarding access to children for this known sexual predator, both now or at any time in the past. In the 90s, First PRC's local consistory did an investigation, of sorts, but they couldn't find anything since no one wanted to talk. Since the known instance of sexual abuse that instigated the confession and discipline was beyond the legal statute of limitation, the consistory felt nothing more could be done. Don Faber remained a member of First PRC but was not allowed to serve as elder again. Since Don moved from First to Grace between 2015 to 2018, we know his papers were not withheld and he was allowed to transfer membership. The PRC claims that instances of misconduct are included on members' papers, but we do not know what is listed on these papers or if First PRC informed Grace PRC of Don's history of sexual abuse of boys when he transferred. To our knowledge, to this date Don Faber has never been investigated by police, legally questioned or prosecuted, or had any legal trouble whatsoever for his sexual abuse of boys, since it appears that the PRC handled it all in-house. The safeguarding from Don was left up to individual families based on knowledge they got from the rumor mill and secret knowledge passed between trusted individuals. This is another pattern that remains true in the PRC, even in historical abuse cases of decades past. Similar to the cases of RVO and Jack Lenting, where people were passing documents and stories that confirmed the abuse discreetly from person to person in a private network of trusted members. The same thing was happening with Don Faber. Don Faber is another example of a decades-long sexual abuser in the PRC, similar to bullet point number 1 Lamb and bullet point number 2 Jack. Lamb lubbers hightailed it and ran when people started sniffing around his past. Jack Lenting was excommunicated and has since recanted his confession, retained a lawyer, and is running out the clock. Each time the church's excuse was that they dealt with it. We already gave Lamb's papers away. What more can we do? We already excommunicated Jack. What more can we do? Well, PRC, what are you going to do about Don Faber? This is the story we alluded to earlier when a source referred to the PRCA as a feeding frenzy for abusers. We have more stories of abuse from this time period by different abusers. The PRC has been this way for a long, long time. The church and the adults in our lives were not protecting us. In many ways, the PRC was 24 divided by 7 divided by 365 open season for sexual predators. The story of Don Faber's abuse has been boiling under the surface for a long time. It is only now when the PRC is faced with public pressure regarding the abuse problems in the church where it has been forced to the surface. We need action now. We cannot wait any longer. The strain that this environment of abuse has put on people is enormous. PRCA, you need to step up immediately and demand this third-party investigation happen. And we must demand that the results of it be public. We simply cannot allow this to remain hidden. The decision makers in the PRC have been endangering people, children, for decades with the way they have handled abuse past and present. We cannot trust them to handle this. It needs to be taken out of their hands and put into the hands of professionals. And the results of the investigation must be pressured to be public to force the PRCA to reckon with this. The behind-closed-doors approach that the PRC has been taking since forever has led to untold amounts of human suffering. New updates from the EXPRC forum as it was learned that Don Faber was asked to sign a participation agreement involving the third-party investigation. Don signed it, but now he is getting cold feet and wants to jump ship over to First PRC. Here is what the forum has to say. Grace PRC required him to sign a participation agreement. He signed it, but apparently doesn't like it, taking bets that First won't make him sign one and that's why he's running. Well, at the very least, Guideposts will catch up with him. I hope tons of people named him in their survey. I doubt First Church will have anything to say to him. When sent all the information in this bullet point, they responded with a letter that said the consistory was satisfied that Don was no longer a danger to the church. This is true in light of the facts that Don's marriage made it impossible for him to continue his abuse of young men that he had as a single man and outlined in the material sent to us. Third-party investigation with public results is the only solution. No more hesitation. No more stalling. We demand action in the form of a third-party investigation with public results, and we demand it now. We believe that readers, especially male survivors, may have new memories or recollections or distress after reading this bullet point. Because of that, we wanted to remind readers about RAINN. RAINN, Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network, is the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. RAINN also carries out programs to prevent sexual violence, help survivors, and ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. Their website is www.rinn.org. They are a reputable and valuable resource for survivors and loved ones of survivors who are looking to explore, understand, and educate themselves on the topic of sexual violence. It is recommended that you read this excellent article by RAINN regarding the sexual assault of men and boys to be better equipped to be able to support and help male survivors of sexual assault. You are not alone. If you or your loved ones need help, RAINN operates a 24/7 hotline at 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673.